This episode of Magma Classroom is the third installment on the essentials of painting with Ryan. In the first part of this series, Ryan covered the various tools in your Magma kit and explored the extremely important fundamentals in painting shape, value, form, and lighting. We kept it light and practiced applying these methods to primitive objects. In the second part of this series, Ryan and our Magma friends jumped into the canvas to continue practicing these same fundamentals in painting a slightly more challenging shape, an apple in grayscale. Now that we've covered the basics of these fundamentals in grayscale, this episode Ryan will be expanding this topic into color, talking about the best practices for shape, value, form, and lighting, but specifically applying these with color. These fundamentals are important even for the pros to continue practicing, so this is an episode you don't want to miss, and stay tuned.
We are on. Hey everybody, welcome to another Magma Classroom. My name is Ryan, and I'll be your captain on this journey into color, and it's bound to be a bit of a bumpy ride, so strap in. A couple of things, basic house rules, and some things you might notice. We have disabled the sequence panel at the bottom. We're going to be focusing just on this canvas. You are welcome to join me, just trying not to take up too much space, because I am going to be demonstrating a few different things, and we'll need a bit of space myself. Any sort of like misbehaving on the canvas, we've got a 3-strike policy, and you will be removed if things get out of hand, but I'm pretty confident everyone here is mature and responsible and more interested in figuring out color. That's why we're here, so I don't think we'll need to worry about that. Alright, so last time we looked at painting an apple in grayscale. The first lesson we looked at just basic shapes, grayscale, understanding value. That was the main objective, and it's one of the absolutely core things in order to improve your painting, is to understand value, your lights and darks. Everything else on top of that will start to fall into place when you have a better understanding of value. Second session, we shifted to a slightly more complex subject, which was the apple, and now we're going to start playing around with color. But before we do, I want to just chat quickly about brush economy, trying to achieve as much as possible in the fewest amount of brush strokes. And it's something that happens when we're beginners, particularly with our drawing. You might have noticed this with yourself. It was certainly the case with me, but I would do a lot of really short strokes as I try to find what I'm busy doing and what I'm trying to draw, right? But that's fine for trying to figure that out, to find your structure, to figure out your composition, to gradually sculpt up what you want to work, but then you paint over it. As a sort of final drawing, it's a bit untidy. It shows that you're trying to figure things out and you're not quite sure where you're going. There are ways to draw like this where it's actually very intentional, and it's quite an amazing way to work. I've got a friend who does ballpoint ink drawings, and he builds up with a lot of this back and forth, very scratchy lines, but it's very intentional. The same applies with painting, right? If we're using bigger brushes and we apply paint like really lightly as we're trying to figure out what we're doing, again, it's fine for when you're trying to figure out next steps, but you don't want your overall painting to look like it's just a bunch of these kind of short, unsure strokes. And it takes a while to build that confidence. So we want to try and do some bolder strokes, particularly early on when we're figuring stuff out, when we're thumbnailing, for example, so that we can go through that process of problem solving and figuring out a little bit faster, so that we can move on to the next phase, which is, the painting, and make our decisions a little bit quicker. So just in terms of grayscale, I just want to demonstrate again how I would typically go about this, because I'm going to apply this as well when we're painting. Now again, I'm using I've got my brush tool active, but I've changed my shape to it's supposed to be the square there. There we go. Sometimes I use the pixel pencil, but you have a few more options available to you when you're using the brush tool, particularly this one here just next to it. That'll make my shape follow along. If I have that deactivated, when I go from side to side, the angle of the brush doesn't change at all, right? But if I put that setting on, the brush will change in accordance to the direction that I'm busy painting. Cool. What else do I need to change here? No, that's pretty much it. So I've also made my density and opacity 100%, turning off the pressure there, because I just want to, I'm not going to try and blend anything in. I'm not trying to make things all smooth. I'm just trying to put down shapes. In this case, it'll be value because I'm just going to do grayscale, but the same will apply with color. And this is how I'll approach things later on in the demo. Okay, so I don't like to work on a white background. This is supposed to be... never mind, doesn't matter. It's got to do with the spacing, I think. So you might notice my canvas refreshes quite a bit. There is something funny going on with my network. So if you hear me making weird sounds and I pause randomly, it's because of that happening. Okay, so I'm going to put down... Actually, I'm going to make this background a little bit lighter because it's a bit too much. But I'm going to start working with a bigger brush, right? So if I were to undo this, this is the key to also doing these, to working on your brush economy. If you start working with smaller brushes, you make the shape and then you start filling in back like this. It takes a little longer. You can do that with a bigger brush in one simple stroke. So I'll do the same here for the background, where it's just back and forth once or twice. And then if we're going to be drawing a sphere, I'll just go with a mid-tone gray. But in one stroke, I can have something that's more or less of a circle. With things like this, I tend to just chuck my light source up on the top left, so that we have a little light on the top left of the subject and a shadow on the right. So I'm going to add in a shadow shape. And again, now I'm thinking about my brush size. Maybe what I had is a bit big for the shadow I want to put in, so I'll drop that slightly. But okay, it's untidy, but one stroke down. Now I want to go a bit lighter for where the light will be landing on it. One stroke, sorted. Of course, it's going to be a cast shadow too. So I'm going to just group the values together for my shadow here and just do that. And there we go. That was, what, like 5 strokes or something to get to this point, but I can already tell where my light source is. I can tell where my shadow shapes, where my light shapes are, and what the cast shadow is doing. And that's enough for me to work with. I can just start refining from here, or go on to try another lighting scheme, another value setup, another position of the lighting, that kind of thing. But I didn't spend a lot of time on this trying to figure out something quite simple. And you can enhance this with a couple extra strokes too. If I want there to be more attention on the light side, I would darken the value a little bit here. That gets a bit close. I'll get darker and go with this sort of setup where I have this dark shape in the background to the top left and lighter on the bottom right, and that just accentuates the lights and darks on the object itself. Okay. If you think about video game icons, often they're applying this sort of principle, where you can clearly tell the form of something like this, the way it's broken up. I should have actually brought in some examples of that. But anyway, so there was just a handful of strokes, less than 10 strokes pretty much, to set up study. So I'm going to apply that again later on. We won't be trying to be quite as efficient in some of the later things, but yeah, this is something worth practicing, and it'll be really valuable for you. And it shows a little bit more confidence. As much as that isn't a perfect sphere right now, it's easy to carve back into it, smooth it out, adjust the transitions in the values so that it's a bit smoother. Yeah, and how you handle these things is will also become something that's quite individual and set to you, and where style will develop. Okay, so we can get rid of that for now and move on to the topic of the day, which is color. Let's make another layer here. Cool. So when we're in conversation, chatting with friends, or we're talking about the color of a car, or whatever, the color of the new iPhone, typically although those tend to be snazzy colors, I always try to zhuzh up the names of colors in there. But generally what we're talking about is the hue of a color. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Let's first let me dial back here. Let's talk about the color wheel. This is something, if you're looking up anything on color theory, this is where we start. We start looking at the color wheel. It's a little more complex than some others you may see. There's a lot more going on. But what we can see here is, okay, I've got a layer open. Cool. So we can break this down. Okay, like I said, there's a lot going on here. It's a very simplified version of pretty much what we have here on the top right. Okay, a little color panel. But there's these clear divisions between colors. And we have, okay, let's change that brush. Why? Okay, sorry, just technical bouncing around. We have a red primary. Okay, well, we have our primary color. Let's break it down first. We talk about primary colors. So we have red over here, blue over here, yellow over here. Okay, those are our primary colors. But when you mix these together, you mix any two of these together, you start to get the complementary color of the other one. Right, so if I go, let's take, where does this sit on the, yeah, interesting little points here. So I'm going to work with the second one. If I take orange, let's my density, make this bigger. Orange and red together. Oh, why is that misbehaving? We'll start to get a bit more, this mixing is going a little funny. Sensitivity is off. That's right, there we go. But we start to get into the oranges. And this is the complementary color for our blue on the other end. Okay, those two colors will work pretty well together. The same applies with yellow, the complementary color here. We get a mixture of red and blue. So let me just point out the complementary colors. Yeah. So those were our primaries. Then we have our secondary colors. I think it's get interesting a little bit over here where it's divided. We have secondary color orange over there. We have a green over here. And we have a purple. Okay. But now, with these, they're made up of two primaries, right? But those colors aren't always necessarily a 50-50 split. Sometimes you have a orange that is a bit more red or is a bit more yellow. Okay. Then we get into our tertiaries. And you keep applying this process, we get the near infinite range that is hue. Okay, and that's this wheel around the outside of our color box here. And this is only one component of color. There are three components. We have just all my things here. We have hue. Okay, so what we typically refer to as color. We have the saturation. Just going to put it as sat. This is how vibrant a color is. And if you look inside our color box here, Okay, wait, I'll get back to it. The third component is value or brightness and canvas refreshing. There we go. So those are the three components. So if we hide this layer and I bring up our color box here, get rid of all that. This is how we'd break it down inside here. Let's choose a nice brighter color to point things out. So this wheel is for hue, picking just a hue. There tends to be very vibrant variation of the color. Over here, we have, whoops, towards the top, this line here is going to be our higher value, typically higher value colors. Towards the bottom, darker values. Okay. Then when we go top to bottom, sorry, left to right to left. On the right, our colors tend to be more saturated. On the left-hand side, things tend to be less saturated. You've added white to them, and they've lost a bit of color. So we're always going to be thinking about, when we talk about color, when we're painting, we think about all these elements, not just, you know, whether it's blue or whether it's green or orange or whatever. We're also thinking about the value. We also think about the saturation, and another component, which is temperature. Now, we've probably, whoops, incorrect. Oh, I've painted over this layer. Silly. Okay. We've mostly been told that, let's switch back to the color wheel here, that we have cool colors and warm colors. Okay, we probably divide that up. Gets a little tricky with some of these, because there's not a hard and fast rule. Now, why is it? Okay, there we go. This is probably what we're going to place as warm and cool. But it's not an absolute, because when it comes to temperature, we're going to be looking more at the relationship of other colors around our sort of chosen area. So a lot of color is really about understanding light that's around it, the color of the environment. There's lots of things that influence how we perceive color. Of course, our own eyes behaving a little differently from the next person's, but there's going to be impacts of light. There's going to be reflected light as this color bounces off that color and then back onto our subject. There's all kinds of things that go on with color, which we will get into a little bit in this lesson, a little bit in future lessons, with how much there is going on. But let's have a little. If we take orange, for example. Speaking of temperature, when I said here that at the top we kind of shift over from, can I bring this back up? We shift over to desaturated, right? We're adding white, but what happens when you add white to a color is that it desaturates it, okay, and it also cools it a bit. When we go down, we add black to it, start adding a bit of a tint, but the color tends to, it's a term I'm going to use a lot, it tends to get warmer, and it tends to get feel a bit more saturated. So we want to pay attention to that directional relationship on our color tools. But here's the kicker. So as much as we're working, let's say we've picked a color high up in our color wheel over here, right? And I'll make a little color dab. I'll drop this in. Okay, we've got this. If you start moving your hue slider around, you start changing the hue, but you're not adjusting anything here in terms of value, saturation, or brightness and saturation. And I'll keep going around. I'll show you some variations. Go here, all the way to purple. Okay. These colors, as much as they're at the same point on our color tools here, they don't necessarily have the same value. Colors have sort of their own inherent value. If I were to switch this to grayscale, right? I didn't change the sort of value on the color tool here, but each color, when switched to grayscale, looks very different. Okay, so that's another thing to keep in mind. This is why the topic gets so intimidating, because there's so much to think about when we're talking about color. But let's switch that back over. So if you want to test this, we have a little view adjustment inside our view menu here. We switch to showing grayscale. I've set a hotkey for this because I find it helpful to frequently switch over to that view to see what my values are doing. This is why I say it's a core thing, right? You want to make sure your values are right first, then color and everything else will start to make a bit more sense. So I've just set Q as my shortcut key for this. So I can quickly check, okay, cool, that value is a little bit off, or it's too light, too dark, and I'll adjust my color accordingly. So we want to keep that in mind. Let's have a look. Make sure I'm not missing anything. Check my notes. Yeah, okay. Now I showed on the color wheel that we have these complementary colors opposite one another. But when you get into painting, using these complementary colors will help to, if I take a red for example, and I'll drop this in after my canvas is done with its temperamental behavior. Oh, okay, well now I've got purple. Cool. Let's work with that. Slightly off. Let's go with this one. A complementary color here would be yellow on this end. If we were to go straight across the other side of the color wheel. But you put these two together, that combination is really intense together when they're right up against one another. It draws a lot of attention, that's for sure. But it can probably get quite tiring quite quickly to look at something. If you've got an overall like a bigger piece with these two like dominant colors at the same saturation next to one another all the time. So this is where we start then playing around with saturation. And if we look inside this color wheel, if we move inward, we can see that we're shifting towards a more gray version of colors. So if I put that yellow next to it, okay, that's a much gentler variation. There's a lot of white added to that to drop the saturation. But that's sitting next to that really powerful purple. It's not very competitive. It's a bit more, a bit more relaxed. Same if we go with a sort of bright orange over here. If I were to go straight across, okay, this is more of a red orange. So I'm going to end up with more of a green blue color to balance it. But next to one another, geez, it's striking. Gets my eye there, but it's pretty intense. So, but what then if I shift the value, shift the saturation down? Okay, I could probably even go quite a bit further than that. Then this combination works a bit better together. Okay, so when I'll get into painting an example just now, when I start using complementary colors to create a more chilled out composition, I'm not going to put the same saturation next to one another. What would make more sense, if you do want to keep things at a similar sort of saturation, is to drop the saturation of both. Go sort of in the middle. Yeah, maybe even a little lower on this end. Okay. They're still on opposite ends, similar kind of characteristics, but they're not quite as zingy next to one another, or not quite so intense. So, okay, let's clear that. But there's another thing to notice with with all of this. Let's take, where's this? Okay, we can take this color. Now I mentioned that when we shift over to the right side, to the left side on our color tool here, we start to desaturate our color and add white to it. And what happens when we do that is that the color becomes cooler. So let's test that. If we go across here and put this next to it, okay, color's definitely a bit more chilled out. And what if we drop the value a bit? Okay, it still looks kind of like brownish, but that gray starts to look a little bit cooler next to the orange. Color relationships are pretty important. Yeah, I mean, you're always going to be thinking about color in terms of relationships, because things are going to look, they're going to look different next to one another. And there's a fantastic example by, I actually forgot to bring this in, by James Gurney, who is, you know, pretty much a master of color. And he shows how, let's find this color box. The same color in two different compositions with other colors around it will look completely different. It was the same, like I said, with values, right? Where you could have a light box and a darker box, but when you put the same midtone in the middle here, it's perceived completely differently. The same is going to apply with color. When you have different values and different colors next to one another, it's going to change what those colors look like. It's going to change how we perceive those colors. It's the same color in terms of the actual tool here, but what we're perceiving is different. So let me find this quickly. Of course, when one looks for it, it's not there. Okay. But he's got a book called Color and Light, and yeah, he discusses this topic in quite a bit more detail. So how do we apply this? Okay, I'm gonna do the sort of sphere study again, applying these same principles. Maybe I'll keep the color wheel open to the side here. If it will move. Got to pick the right thing. There we go. Okay, so there are two different approaches I might take with a subject like this. It's a very simple subject. It's just a sphere. There's nothing going on in the background. It's just going to be color and light, shadow. So let's go with that purple again that we had. I kind of like that. Let's say I want to make my sphere a sort of purple sphere. Okay. I'm just dropping this as a color. This is not where I'm going to start painting. And I want to have this balanced composition. I'm going to think, well, okay, there's got to be a bit of yellow in here somewhere. Maybe I'll use that as the background color. But like I said, I'm not just going to grab the more or less same. I'm not going to just shift over to the other end of the canvas and take that exact same sort of yellow-green color. It looks quite a bit different on this when I jump around. But if I were to, let's work with the color wheel aspect here. I'm not going to just drop that in the background and put the purple on top of it. That's going to be a bit intense. So what I'm going to do is shift my value down, or add white to it, so it cools that a bit more. And it's just well, I may as well just carry on painting here. But our subject still stands out nicely inside this. Let me do this bigger. Switch it the other way around, where I first put down that background. Okay, and then let me try to do this in one swoop. We have our sphere. Okay, now my next decision to make is what is the color? What is the light doing? And is there a bit of color to light? I'm not going to play with actual colored light like RGB lighting. You know, I'm not going to sit here with this sort of intensity of color. I'm going to think about warm white, cool white. right? We've seen these bulbs in the shops. Warm white tends to be more on the orange side. Cool white tends to be on the bluer side. And I'm going to think about light from that perspective. Well, let's say I want my light to be warm, falling on this object. Okay, and to accentuate that, okay, if I'm going to go with a warm color, let's say, what would a warm white kind of light be? Something around there, just to give the idea. It's going to be a warmer. Let's desaturate it a bit. Let's go a bit more to yellow. To accentuate the fact that we have warm light, I'm going to make our shadows a bit cooler. So in terms of what's going on here, we can cool our shadows. This is quite like a warmish, as much as this is purple, a so-called cold color. It's kind of warm. It's still quite warm. It's got a bit of that black in it. It's quite vibrant. But now I want to figure out a shadow for this. So I might push my hue down a little bit, and shadows tend to gain a bit of saturation. And I will throw this in there. Doesn't quite make sense. Let's see what happens if we go towards gray. Not looking good. So we'll bump up the saturation a bit more. And there's a lot of this back and forth process that can go on. But if you're trying to be more economical with your strokes, you can make those decisions and tests much quicker. Right? Okay. Now the same thing with our light. But how is this warmish orangey light going to land on our ball? What is that going to do to the color that we perceive on it? Well, let's do a little test of something here. See, I've painted on the wrong layer again. Whoops. Control Z, wrong buttons. There we go. So I'm going to make that shape in here. I've got a normal layer over here, and then I'm going to just find a sort of warmer color here, maybe go a bit lighter, and on a separate layer, set to overlay, which is nice for dealing with light, I'm going to like dab a bit of color on there. See how now that sort of color of light, okay, it was a bit more intense, but I want the light to be a little lighter. See how that changes the purple. But what tends to happen when you're shining light on something, colors will desaturate a bit. So I'll color pick from that, and I'll just lighten it a little bit, and I'll drop that in there. All right. So there's our ball, at least. But now we've got this background to think about as well, and the color of your light is also going to affect your background. But you can make some decisions on your own to accentuate parts of the painting where you want people's attention to be. But let's just think about the shadow here. Also notice just where these sit in terms of values and how those change. As I move my eyedropper around, you can see how the shadow is a darker value. We have our sort of a mid value in our local color here, this purple. And as we shift in there, the value goes up a bit and also desaturates. Okay, so we're keeping, if I were to now press Q, okay, cool. We can see that there's definitely some change in our values. It could be stronger, could be more interesting, but we're going to get to that. But so far we're on track. Now I've got this background to think about, and I want this to be cooler in the shadow. But I don't necessarily want it to go towards green. If I were to go anti-clockwise on my color wheel from this point, I'd be going into a much warmer temperature color. If I went the other way, it would be going cooler. But we could also drop the saturation. We're going to add a little bit of black into that, which will add a bit of saturation. And I suppose we could dial in just a little bit towards green. and chuck this there. And then we've got our shadow. Okay? But I want to accentuate this by, like we did in our initial ball exercise over here, where we had a darker bit of background to bring out the light on this side, and likewise the reverse on the other side. I'm going to apply the same thing over here. But now we've already got quite a light background, and I don't necessarily want things, for this piece anyway, I don't want my background to be darker than the shadow that's being cast. This is just a decision I'm making. Depending on how you have things set up, you might make a different decision. And people talk about art being a long series of questions and decisions. This is kind of what we're talking about. There's all these kinds of little things you want to think about, and it's a back and forth process right through until you decide that a painting is finished. So anyway, we've got this color here, and we've got this one here. If you look at the color wheel on the top right, just where our value and saturation, mostly our value thing, is changing here. I'm going to go for something sort of in between. Come up a little bit. Now I did shift this from here. I did go a little bit towards green when I brought that down. Now I might want to shift a little bit warmer in my backgrounds. Okay, so there's a bit of contrast between the hue shift in my shadows and my lights. And we do have a warm light source being cast. So where there is area getting light, it's going to be a little bit warmer. So I'll do the same thing, drop a little bit in value, but I'm going to shift my slider slightly to the other direction. And do this. And now we have a pretty basic setup. It reads as a sphere with light on it, fairly warm environment, got some slightly cooler shadows, and we could probably push that quite a bit further. Okay, so if we want to start smoothing out, how do we do that in here? I've shown you in other classes. We start manipulating our tool settings. Okay, I might turn off my size pressure sensitivity. I'm still staying with this square brush, right? I know a lot of people ask for blending brushes and all. You don't need it. You start playing around with your settings, you can get a lot out of the same brush. I'm going to make sure my density is responding to pressure by checking that box, but maybe I'll drop my density and opacity a little bit so that when I make a stroke, it's got a bit of both the color picked color and the one underneath it, and then I'll color pick from that and work back, and I'll sort of, whoops, see now my settings went and changed. And I'll just go back and forth like this till I get a smoother transition, because it is a sphere after all. And maybe this is a bit more of a reflective sphere, so that warm light is going to reflect a bit more on our ball. I know this is untidy, but that's a study, right? Don't going to get too attached to it. So I will shift a little bit warmer again, desaturate. Depending on how reflective the surface is, it might capture the color of that light in a very crisp way. It might be, something sort of like that. If it's super reflective, let's go with that. But if it's a less reflective thing, it's probably going to spread out a bit more and alter the color underneath it a bit more. But that starts to look like a bit of an interesting shape. I'm going to make this a bit cooler, just to accentuate things. And then we're also going to have a contact shadow. Which again, I'm going to keep enhancing the cools in my painting here, or the color temperature relationships. Well, what else is going on here? Light bounces around. That light's going to hitting. There's other things in the environment, and that's going to bounce back into back onto the surface of our ball. So let's see it. We've got a warm light. It's getting bounced around. I'm going to shift this slightly, but it's not going to be as intense here. So I'm just going to do a light little bit there. So there's a little bit of light being bounced up. Okay. There we've got one. We can leave it there. We can call that one study. Let's have a look. I've got my comments minimized here. I hope everyone's following around. Okay, now I'm just checking if there's any questions about this so far. But let's do another one and choose a different color. Or actually, let's go with the same color. We're going to change what our lighting is doing. Now my approach here, remember, was to think about the local color of our object. A local color is what the color is without with minimal sort of light influence on it. It's kind of the inherent color of an object. But you know, if it's in a room with bright red walls and a light on, you know, that red's going to reflect onto the subject, and it's going to change how we perceive the color of it as well. But then we've got more like reflected light, we've got our key lights, all that kind of stuff. But we're just looking at the local value here, the local color. So let's do the same thing. Exactly the same starting point. Where I'm going to make my brush nice and big. Yeah, fill in that area. Let's zoom out a bit. I'm going to take my local color here, drop that in, one stroke. Now, we've decided to go with a cooler light. So we're going to have a white that's a bit more on the blue side. And to accentuate that, I'm going to start making my shadows a bit warmer. They're at least going to appear much warmer. So let's drop that in first. I'm going to make sure I've color pick my local value here, my local color. And I'm going to shift a little bit towards warm. And I'm going to increase our saturation, add a bit of black to it so it also bumps up the temperature here. And in a single stroke. Okay, that's a much warmer. Oh, I can't undo because my canvas refreshed. Okay, just neaten that up a bit. That's a bit wild. And then I'm going to color pick my local color again. And I know that we've got a cooler white color on it. I know that adding a bit of white cools down my color. And light going to increase the value a little bit. And maybe I just want to strengthen things by shifting down towards blue. I'm doing this at high opacity, high density, because it's decision making. And it's just to make sure things are clear. Now, if I switch to grayscale, I can see that the values here between the shadows and the midtones are a bit too close together. So I'm going to go with that and add in a little bit more. So one approach to actually doing this is to think about going halfway to black. Okay. When you think about your shadows, a rule of thumb. Again, nothing is absolute. A lot is going to depend on what you're trying to achieve in your piece and what you're seeing in front of you. But general rule of thumb, halfway to black. And we're making them a bit warmer. Yeah, that's a little bit darker. Can probably come in a little bit more because of the inherent value of that purple. It gets a little difficult to increase things a bit. Well, but there we go. That's a better transition, or a better value relationship. Hello, color pick, please. Color pick. What on earth is going on here? I've color picked the right color. Everything's at a high saturation. And I've got my brush. Okay, there we go. It was painting white for some reason. Now, same approach with the shadows in the background. Here I went with a cooler shadow being cast, cooler cast shadow, because of having the warmer light, and where there isn't that light, it just generally appears cooler. Now I'm going to do the reverse. We've got a cooler light, and I want this general background color to be a bit warmer. So for one, it is a shadow, so I'm going to bring the value down a bit. We can go sort of halfway to black, I suppose, maybe not as far. and I'll shift it a bit towards warm over here. Grays tend to look quite cool. So I'm going to bump up the saturation a little bit. Yeah, that's a warmer shadow. Okay. And similar thing here with the background. I want things to stand out a little bit on the left hand side, which is already, it could be lighter. Could be lighter. Let's go here. So if I look at that sort of value hue relationship, I want to go somewhere sort of in between, not as dark. But I am making it a little bit warmer than the rest of the background. Okay. And now maybe because we've got that blue light, I might want to shift actually what the background color is doing. So if I want that to be a little cooler, because now we've got this slight tendency towards warm. Sorry about the constant refreshing of my canvas. It's unavoidable. And to contrast that, I'm going to shift what's going on in the background to a bit cooler. Part of how we do that is to desaturate a bit and add in a little bit of that blue light that's coming in. It's a subtle change. You're probably not going to see very much in here. We can go deeper on that, if not a little bit more. Yeah, but that blue light's going to start pushing things towards green. Color pick blues. You're supposed to color pick. So I normally have my color picker set to my pen button. Why is it not color picking? Oh, that's annoying. My tool refuses to color pick. When in doubt, hard refresh. Check if I have a comment here. Cool. Let's do it again. What is going on? Oh, because I see what's happened here. All my layers are, with this refreshing, I've ended up on the wrong layer. And that's why my colors aren't behaving the way that they should. Let's hide that. Okay. Again. If I want to accentuate these relationships, right? Got a cool white light over there. I want to maybe bump up the contrast over here. So to add a bit of warmth, I'm going to shift over in saturation primarily. And I'll smooth that out. And you can kind of see, okay, well, this doesn't really work. It's a bit too much. Let's desaturate it a little bit, maybe come down in value. There's a lot of this sort of back and forth of trying to figure out what's going to work. So that's one approach, right? To figure out your local color, choose a desaturated complementary color for your background and use that as the base to build up from. Smooth these into one another. The other approach is to think more about a color scheme that you want for your piece. If I want something to be warmer, a bit more of a blue, and work up from an underpaint or a sort of general color, a sort of hue that you want to be cast sort of over everything. So let's get rid of this. Let's actually just get rid of this one in particular. Taking up a bit too much space. And this can be erased. So how do we approach the same thing here? Now so that the starting point is going to be with a kind of background color and overall color that I want everything to sort of fit into. So if I want things to be generally quite a bit cooler. Maybe it's a sort of bluer environment. I'm going to go across. How are we doing for time, by the way? One thing, I have not had any water. Okay, cool. I've almost been waffling on for about an hour. Let's see. So I want things to be generally a bit on the blue side. I'm going to start anyway, right? You can go with any color. I'm going to go with this blue. Make my brush nice and big. Max opacity and density. Size is standard. Let's hide this away. And let's do it on a new layer because bound to make a mess of things. Cool. So now I'm going to just block in that color. It's probably way too big, but anyway. And let's say I just want to put in a lighter sphere. Yeah, let's say something that, yeah, just a lighter, almost like a sort of neutral value and color sphere. But I want things to still be a bit on the cooler end. Let's have a look here. Going through my own various exercises that I've been doing. And I'm going to drop this in. Okay, it's quite great. But now, okay, I've made this decision that this is sort of if I was going to put in, let's say, like more of an egg sort of color, I can do it sort of like that. But it's in this blue environment. I want things to stay kind of blue. It'll probably shift over a bit, desaturate, kind of be somewhere around here. Oops, let's undo that. Now, I want things to be more on the blue end. Come over, just keep changing this. Change this till I'm happy with it. I want my lighting to be blue as well, like to be cooler in this environment as well. Perhaps that's what's making this overall palette quite a bit cooler. So to enhance that, I want my shadows to be warmer. But I'm going to make the decision. I'm not just going to say, okay, well, my colors are going to just be orange or whatever. It's going to be in relation to what's here on the canvas already. So in the background, for example, I'm going to follow the same kind of scheme here. In the background, if I want my colors to be warmer, let's see, it's a bit of an interesting point over here because it almost looks sort of evenly spaced between what we would define as warm and cool. But what we can do, let's color pick that again. One thing is to add a bit of black into things, maybe saturate a little bit, and things will feel quite a bit warmer. This next to that blue looks warmer. It doesn't look colder. Okay, so that's kind of how we start thinking about things. The general relationship here was, as we shift more towards white, it tends to cooler color. As we shift towards black, if we saturate it a bit, it starts to feel warmer next to whatever your starting color was. So let me erase that a little bit, and I'll just do it like this, setting up more or less the same thing. Okay. And then we've got our shadow. I'll stick with the same color for now. This is all just about setting things up, setting up my values. And then on the sphere itself, well, okay, we're going to have a cool light landing on it. It's a little difficult because I started off with this being quite light already. But there we go. We sort of shifted it a little bit cooler and bumped up the value. Gives us a little something. Same thing on the other side. Probably going to go the other direction because now we want the shadows to be a bit warmer. So here I might shift it a little bit towards, going towards my warms on this side. Because remember, with the light, I shifted it clockwise. Now I'm going to shift a bit in the other direction. And to make things feel a bit warmer, and it is in the shadows after all, I'm going to just adjust my value and saturation a little bit as well. Maybe that's even gone too green. Yeah, make my brush a bit bigger. There we go. Okay, and now we can start smoothing out things from this point. This really doesn't look... It's difficult to really tell the value on this, the light falling in there. So we can blend in a little bit by dropping our opacity and our density. Keep our brush size more or less the same, and lightly going back and forth, color dabbing, just to smooth out some of these transitions. Not of the shadow, of course. Maybe I want the background to be darker. I say maybe because it's just a decision I'm making. I want the attention to be on the ball. It doesn't really matter what's going on in the background. I can decide how to bring that forward. I'm not trying to replicate an exact still life in front of me. So if I want to go darker, okay, we can drop the value down a bit. It's still already trended towards warm, so I'm just going to drop the value like so, and I'll keep going back and forth in this way. Let's loosen this up a little bit. Now the value here still looks a little close to my background, and yeah, there's enough of a shift going on over here, but I think it could be better. So I'm going to bump up the saturation a little bit on that. Drop the value a little bit. What does my halfway to black approach look like in this? We go halfway to black, bump up the saturation a little bit, trend this towards warm. Okay, that's a more striking terminator line where the change in form, it's turning away from the light. And here, oh, it could even go. We could shift this down a little bit because I feel like I'm not getting my lights. So again, see what I mean? A lot of back and forth. Trying to figure out how I want to do things. But I don't have much saturation here. I'm playing around with all these colors. Now my ball's changed quite a bit in shape, and that's fine. I changed a bit in shape, changed a bit in color. It's going to be a bit of a contact shadow going on. These could be small. Of course, when I zoom in, it looks nightmarish, because these all need to be blended a little bit more smoothly. And when I color, I'm also trying to follow the form of my ball, which kind of goes in two directions, right? And then we're going to have a bit of a cool light bouncing up along the side here. Just drop a bit of a line there. It's probably going to be a little bit bouncing up in here. And that's enough to kind of start working with. So now I want to apply this to an apple, because that's what we've been focusing on in some of our lessons. Let's apply all these same principles to that. Another refresh. But perhaps let's do the same thing like we did before, but decide to go with a much warmer palette instead of the blue. So I'm repeating this because it is something that has to. It takes a little while to figure out approaches when you're working with warmer light or warmer color palette, cooler light, cooler palette. Let's go over it again. So now I want maybe a nice orange background to start. Do this on a new layer. Brush nice and big, very opaque. Yeah. Fewer strokes as possible. There we go. And I want to put a more sort of eggshell color ball in here. I'm going to keep the value a little bit lower this time, learning from the previous one. Drop that in. Let's undo that last bit. Okay. I want this to be overall warm. Maybe the lighting's a bit warmer on it. So I want my shadows to be a bit cooler. But what happens with this? With an orange. Yeah, I could shift it. When you get to these tricky points where it's like, oh, which way do I kind of shift the direction? To get a cooler variation on the orange, you can add a bit of white to it. Maybe we drop the value a little bit because it's going to be... Oops, move my screen around. Because it's going to be a shadow. But that looks quite a bit cooler next to this strong orange. Yeah. So we can kind of bring that into our background. Let the canvas refresh and do its thing. Make sure I cut it. Whoops, that's much bigger than I was going for. But could be a bit stronger to find this. Being quite loose about it. Do the same thing here. Keeping that same general look of things. Just have a little sip of water. Stay hydrated. Oops. Okay, so I've tried to go cooler in the background. A little warmer with the lights to accentuate things here. Obviously need a shadow here first. So I'm keeping warm, but I'm dropping the saturation because I want things to be cooler in the shadows. Let's see how that looks. That works for me for now. And then with that warm light coming into it, I'm going to raise my value and maybe desaturate it a little bit, shift it towards a bit of orange. How's my value structure looking there? Not too bad. Could be stronger. So let's bring this down a little bit more and bring that into this middle section where we're going to have the terminator line. And the way I'm looking at this, to reiterate, is that there's going to be bounce light affecting the sort of sides of our sphere. But here's kind of the area where that change in form happens. There's likely to be less light hitting that point because it's sort of in the middle. You've got your light coming from one direction. Let me draw this out. You've got your light coming from up here. It's hitting surfaces on this side and bouncing back at our ball. But here, it's kind of faced a little bit away from both the floor, the surface that the ball's resting on, and away from the light. So it's turned away from both sources, the key light and your reflected light. And so this section tends to be a little bit darker. So if you've seen people do this spheres like this, that's what we're seeing. That's what's happening. Let's try to get rid of these lines. Good enough undos. Good stuff. Is that all making sense? Well, I think so. Now, like I said, there's always these relationships, and I'm always trying to. That's not going for. Let's do this. I'm figuring things out as I go with how warm or how cool I want things to be. Where do I want attention to be? Maybe this this bright orange background is a little too much all the way around. Good starry night sky. I'm glad everything's making sense. We've got a warm light coming in here, which is going to be a little bit of a lighter value. I'm going to bring it across here, desaturate a bit because that tends to happen with light. And I'm going to bring a bit of that into these spaces here as a contrast with our shadow on both the side of the ball and the cast shadow. Whereas here we've got the dark to emphasize the light. And I might just make two quick bold strokes here. We're going to blend that in from this point. So we've got this orange, it's all good. I like it. But I just want to emphasize these edges a little bit more. So I dropped in That's slightly warmer, slightly yellower. Could even go a bit more with this. Up the value. And it just accentuates those areas. You don't have to now do this entire bottom half that same color. It's just a touch. And blending that in. And same you could do on the side. Let's go. We're making our backgrounds cooler. Always trying to remember, keep in mind this relationship. Let's desaturate it a little bit. Drop the value some more. Can go quite a bit further. Just a touch there. And blend that. Trying to be quite gentle and controlled with my tool here. Just blending that in to accentuate the light that's going to be hitting here. I'm going to keep playing with that because now this could still be a little bit brighter with that light coming in. Shift the values. Okay. It's rough, but it gives me plenty of information. And overall, this color palette is quite warm. As much as I don't have an obvious blue or something that's complementing the orange in here, I have a cooler orange, a bit more saturated because I'm going into the shadows, but it appears to be a little warmer cooler and a little bluer in comparison to that bright coppery orange. But you could still actually want to make things interesting, throw in a little bit of blue. Let's dial over here. It might start looking weird. I want to keep it desaturated because if I add in strong blues, it might start looking weird. But I'll just drop in like maybe a little touch. Just little touches in there. And this is when you've got, as much as I say like you only need a simple brush, and you do only need a simple brush like this, sometimes other brushes will give certain strokes, like nice textured strokes, where what's underneath shows through a bit better. And then you layer those strokes on top of one another, and it's that combination of what's on top and what's underneath and the texture applied to it that starts to make things interesting. But now there's a touch of blue in there to cool things down even more without compromising the overall palette and the darkness of our shadow there. And then we can start smoothing out. But that's most of the work done in a very short space of time in terms of knowing what's going on with color. That's probably even too much. You could dial it back quite a bit more. Just tiny little hints of the blue. Okay. So, shall we move on to an apple? The next sort of phase of things. This is where I'll invite you to kind of jump in on the canvas with me. Like I said, we haven't got the sequence panel open, but you're welcome to join me on the canvas here. I mean, even this exercise, I could refine this so much further. I could take a little bit more time, could make this quite a bit neater, darken the background, and my screen's quite bright, so the way you're seeing the values here might be quite different to what I'm seeing. But I could push this all quite a bit further, neaten things up quite a bit, because it's not exactly spherical the way I've done things, right? Maybe deepen some shadows, all the while still trying to be mindful of what my color relationships are. This I might want to shift a bit warmer. Light around it. Here as well, could be darker. And to check values, yeah, starting to look better. If I zoom out, it reads fairly clearly. It definitely could be a little darker here, at least on my screen. It's another complication with doing digital art, is what's going on the screen. What your screen color is doing. This could also be, and now see what I'm doing here. I'm working from grayscale now. I'm color picking from this, and I think it could be a bit of a darker value, but it's still meant to be cooler. So I'm shifting. Ooh. Starry Night Sky, you've set your thing to presenting. You've hit the presenter mode on your screen, so it's made all of us follow what you're doing on your screen. So just above, you've got the call button and the chat window. Above that, there should be like a little present button. If you click that, it should end the thing. Fun times in the classroom. I mean, if I don't know what sort of device you're working on, but if you're on an iPad or something that's touch sensitive, sometimes the sharp bit of your hand, it picks up that as a touch. I've started numerous calls with myself in Magma just because my hand's been in the bottom corner. So just above, you've got your chat window on the bottom right, just to the left of the layers panel, and you've got a telephone icon, and just above that there's normally like a presenter's icon, and there should be the option there to deactivate presenter mode. Let me make sure. Oh, it's not there. There we go. Cool. Thank you. So what I was doing here is I was in grayscale, right? And I need the shadow to be a little darker here underneath where it's making contact with the surface. Our contact shadow. So I don't really need to go back to color to figure this out. I can stay in grayscale, color pick from that shadow area. I know my color's meant to be cooler, so maybe add a little bit of white to it, but I want it to be darker, so I'm also going to shift a little bit down towards black and bring that in. Okay. Maybe that's a little strong there. So I can work even in grayscale. I know I've got the basic colors down and those color relationships, and I can color pick from those in grayscale. It still alters things here. If you look at the color wheel on the top right, it's not picking grays, it's picking colors. So it's just my view has changed to grayscale. But I can make these changes based on what I know about how adding black or adding white, adjusting saturation will affect the color temperature and the value of what I'm working on. Okay. Here as well, come in a little bit deeper. Zoom out. That looks a little bit more interesting. Can shift that down a little bit. Want that to be clear. Okay, so what happens now when I switch back? Yeah, that still reads and makes total sense. To me, anyway. So there we go. Let's shift onto a little apple then. I'm going to make this smaller. And I'll shift it over into the corner, put it out of the way. Where's the other one here? Whoops. Just got to do a little management here of the layers, which I didn't do so well. Make it smaller, shift it over. This area can be erased. And I'll bring a reference image now for our apple, and we can approach this in the same way. You're welcome to join me, or you can just watch as I tackle it, and hopefully do it in a way that makes sense. But I'll do it with both of those approaches, right? So let's bring our let's grayscale. Here's our apple, and let's get our color wheel separated. Control X, Control V. Okay, now it's on a separate layer. I'll do them on behave. There we go. So I think based on the current canvas size, things still should be easy enough for people to zoom in and work quite neatly. Okay, let's first make a new layer for myself. The first approach, like we did, was to look at the local value of our subject. Sorry, the local color and value. Obviously now we're thinking about more than just one or the other, and we think about all these components together. But I'm gonna say, okay, it's a bit of a, if I squint my eyes and look at this, what if I want to try and follow things a little bit to what's going on here? There seems to be a bit of warmth. Like it's lighter, but it's sort of warmer where the light's hitting. Although the light itself looks like it could be a bit cooler. And then on the shadow, let's see. Your eyes might perceive it a little bit differently, but that actually looks warmer to me, and the light looks cooler. But it's just these little bits where the color, there's a bit of changing color on the apple. So let's wing it. Okay, now because of my refresh, I lost my undos. I'm looking for a red, and let's go with something. I don't want to color pick directly from this. I'm trying to train myself to understand like what I'm seeing here, and to try and isolate those colors over. Easier said than done. Interesting. Okay, I'm going to just have a look at what that looks like at full opacity. No, that looks a little too warm. Shift over here. Okay, I think we can work with that. So, okay, I'm going to go with a red, and I'm going to want a background that is complementary to that. So I'm going to look to the other side here and go with something that's a bit green. I might not go... I'm definitely not going to go with the same sort of point on my in my box here. I'm definitely going to desaturate that a bit. And we can decide if we want something that's a little bit warmer. Do we want something a little bit cooler? Let's go with something a little bit warmer. Okay. Yeah, those two colors will be fine to start. So let's do this a little bit more neatly. That's the background color, and that's going to be the other color. My local value for my apple. Now, like we did before with our apple studies, we looked at the rough shapes. Maybe it's easy here to, as much as it's a simple shape, maybe you want to sketch things out. And it's okay to be a little rougher in your sketches. With this, shift over. So I want to simplify these shapes. I'm going to do this. It's a line that goes a bit this way. Sort of, I don't want to go perfectly horizontal, but it comes down. Darn the refresh. Comes down an angle here. I find it easier to do things with this straight line approach and make choices about where there's changes in the planes. It just simplifies everything quite a bit more. This, it comes over and down and across. And then it changes here. Comes down. And it's quite high up that it starts to angle down. We have our shadow. There is a bit of a change in here. I'm probably putting more information now than I need. But let's say this is where it kind of angles in, and we've got our stalk over there. Light shape, shadow shape. It will work with that. Okay. I'm going to keep this on top because I want to use it again later. Oh, do you guys have the canvas link, by the way? I'm not sure. It might be in the description. But if not, and you do want to join, I will... oh, it won't let me Why will it not let me comment here? Interesting, interesting. Okay, maybe I'll just demo it. Maybe you're on your own canvas, you can follow along. It'll be easier. So I've chosen this. This is my background color. This kind of could even desaturate that a bit further. Because as much as, check how close this is to gray, right? But we'll see now that when I'm going to switch over to my big square brush, make that nice big. I'm going to leave that on for now. I'm desaturating that a bit more to demonstrate. It's quite close towards gray. Almost all the way, just slightly offset. I'll make my shape here. Yeah. Now I'm going to take my local color chosen for the apple. And I want to do this also in as few strokes as possible. This is why this shape change with the angle that I'm drawing is nice. Okay, that's a little bit hectic. It's fine that it's not perfect, but there's one line. Okay, you could probably neaten this up just a little bit because that is quite obnoxiously out of the way over the lines. Okay. Now the approach here. Look how green this gray actually looks though next to this red, right? And it was only, if we compare here, it's such a. Let's bring this in closer. That desaturation shift isn't massive, and even more if we go all the way over to gray. Okay, it's really difficult to kind of see the difference there, but just this touch over towards green, the gray looks greener. So yeah, color relationships. How should we do this? Maybe do a warm light on it. Decisions you got to make. Warm light accentuated with cooler shadows. I'm not necessarily following the exact reference here. I know that this kind of looks a little bit warmer, perhaps. I'm changing the color scheme, but the way the shadows work on that object and on that form is going to be the same. I'm just changing the colors that are being used, changing the temperature of the light and so forth, and the background. We're going to change that a bit too. Okay. Oh, sorry, so dry. Okay, so shadows. Shadows are going to be, we're doing a warm light, shadows are going to be cooler. How do we get cooler in our shadows with this, which is already so close to gray, so we can't really desaturate much more, but we can drop our value sort of halfway to black. Shadows tend to be a little bit more saturated. I'm going to keep repeating these same things over and over again. And because it's cooler, we could shift it just a smidge over towards blue. Okay, one drop of the pen does the job. I'm going to want the same thing in my background, because my light, when I do studies like this, my light source always just comes from the top left. That's just how I work. It's one less thing to think about when I'm trying to solve other problems. And now it's starting to look a little bit too gray, so I'm going to bump up the saturation in here a bit more. It's going to look a little greener, but not, it's not like super green. It's not like that. It's not Christmas up in here. It's just subtle things. So you can do it like so. Now apply the same thing to our subject. We've got a warm light, cool shadow, typically cooling something. It gets interesting because sometimes you can just drop the value here, shift over towards purple. Doesn't quite work. I'm going to put a little bit of white into it, drop the value a little bit more. That's quite strong. And also not exactly correct placement here, but I'm going to group my shadow area here. Shift a little bit back towards, start again. So to make things cooler, I'm shifting over a little bit to the left, adding a bit of white, but it is in the shadow, so I'm dropping my value a little bit. There we go, that'll do. And with our light, it is light, so you know it's going up in value, but it's a bit warmer. Drop that in. Okay. Now I know that my values aren't quite right with my shadows here, because red is so, it's got quite a strong value already, just at its local point, just up here. It's quite strong. So I want this to be deeper, and I am going to shift it a bit cooler. Yeah, it's maybe a bit intense. We can work things back, but it reads better. Oops. Can maybe smooth that out a little bit for now. We'll enhance some shadows and push back, all of that in a moment. But I'm just color dabbing and mixing in. Here, this could be brighter, but like I did with our previous exercises, right? As much as, let's take our values for example, as much as I take a mid-tone value and I have a shadow on one side and a shadow on another side, I tend to work with a 5-point scale, 5-point value scale. Not going all the way to white. But when I start out, I try to keep just here with those three. So we're not going to our deepest shadows, we're not going to our brightest lights. We're somewhere in the middle, because that then gives us range to move on either side based on what we're seeing and what we want to achieve. I didn't put any music on for the stream. If I look at what's going on in my reference, there's also a little bit of shadow on here. So I'm going to make this a bit smaller. One stroke should capture it. I see I'm missing that edge there. And it's a little bit of light bumping up over there. We've got a contact shadow too that comes underneath here, which is quite dark. So I'm going to drop my value. It's a little bit smaller. So now I know, especially when I zoom in, that this is looking pretty messy, pretty ugly. And that is a normal phase for any painting while you're figuring things out. That's exactly what this is. It's figuring out how things are going to look. And I want to accentuate a little bit more here. We've got warmer light, cooler shadows. Maybe I will have to shift hue because I can't really adjust my saturation much more. Wait for the canvas to refresh. And whoa, so much for all that color picking decision. Let's shift down a little bit just to accentuate where the light is going to be on the side. Blend that in. I said we got this warmer light, and we still got quite a green. We still got a lot of this standard background that we started off with, but I want to increase the attention to the edges of our shadow and on the shadow side of our apple. So I'm going to just warm this up a little bit. So how do we do that? Well, we can add a little bit more saturation, bump up the value, and maybe we'll shift just a smidge towards our warms on this end, and just lighten that up a little bit. Make that a bit bigger. The value, blend it in. But now that edge stands out quite a bit more. Here we can warm the light even more. Light often desaturates. It's weird. It's red. But that's why when we do look at that apple, as much as it did look like a bit of a, it warmed up over here, but then it was cool. As the light gets brighter, it's quite reflective, but as it gets brighter, it loses a bit of saturation. So you have quite a play of warm and cold going on over there. Okay, now we can start smoothing out. I'll make this a bit bigger. So that's using that approach, going with the complementary colors and building this up. Maybe there's going to be a little bit of shadow here as it turns towards the floor. Soften it up. That's maybe too much. So sometimes when you try to increase saturation on red, it's especially if you are very close over here already. What you can do is start introducing other colors. Like a bit of an orange. Just add in a touch there. That's quite intense. Let's lighten it up a little bit. But you can make that red start to look a bit more vibrant when you bring other colors in. I've still got my line work on top, which adds to the messy look. It's alright. But we zoom out. Okay, it looks like there's some warm light falling onto the thing. We've got cooler shadows. Could even probably make this a touch warmer. Why not? All these back and forth decisions. Decisions. That's maybe too intense. Let's drop that down a bit. But I want to erase things like when I make these decisions, I want to erase it, especially if you are using lower density in your brushes or you're using texture brushes, because it becomes a layer in the process and it adds something to it. Obviously, when you're painting on canvas, you can't erase, you can't undo, you have to paint over, and that adds a nice quality to your paintings because there's history to it. Okay, so if you do want to try and get traditional look in your paintings, in your digital paintings, try and approach things the same way that a analog traditional painter would. They don't have a lot of these tools that we have in Photoshop or Magma or whatever, where you can undo and cut and move things and transform. You have to paint over. And when you get up close to some paintings, you can see those little bits of history and where things have changed. Or at the very least, if you're working with thick paint, it adds it's three-dimensional, right? As much as it's painted sort of evenly on, it's a layer on top of a layer of matter, and it can get textured in that kind of way, not just with this visual, but with these actually bumps on a painting. Interesting things will show through. Okay, let's get this little stalk in, and I think I will shift over to the other approach from here. Okay, still a lot I can do to refine this. Actually, this orange is starting to make it look more like a pepper, which is not quite what I want. Now when I look at this, so let's bring that more shocking red over. Make this a bit smaller. There we go. Just color dabbing, mixing things in. Let's back and forth. Okay, let's move on. So that's that approach. How did we go with things in our other approach? We decide on more or less what sort of color palette we want to work with. Do you want to go with a cooler color palette? Do we want something that's a bit more blue? Maybe it's nighttime, there's a bit of moonlight or something, which gives that nice cold blue light on. Or do we want that sort of sunset, warm color landing on our thing. So let's move over. I'm going to grab that sketch on a new layer. Well, that didn't work. Okay, it is there. I didn't have the right layer selected, that's why. Control C, Control V, there we go. Cool. So now I'm going to choose a background color that will dictate the overall palette. Okay, so if we were to go with, let's go with something again that's quite cool. Cool in temperature. Find a bit of a blue here. Let's go with that. Put this on a separate layer. The layers are starting to get out of hand. Again, starting big strokes, brush economy. I want to get as much of this down, as few strokes as possible. So I've made my brush nice and big. Bumped up the opacity and flow or density here, and I'm just going to pop that in. Okay. Now we've got a kind of red apple in this cold environment. That's kind of what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about the environment as being cold and a bit bluer, and so everything in that environment is going to have it's going to move around that sort of color, and it's going to have a bit of a bluishness to it. So if I were to have that same red, for example, that we chose for the apple, but now it's in this blue environment, it's quite a bit cooler. So maybe I will shift it over a bit. Let's see, try and find another color. That can work. Again, that's a bit too much. Let's go back to our red. That's a bit better and a bit all over the place too, because I have a minimum size thing changing. Angle jitter is low. Okay. We can neaten all this stuff up later. And then what sort of temperature of light do we want on this? We can go with a blue light. It's in a blue environment. We can go with a cooler light. So our shadows are then going to be, they're going to feel warmer next to the rest of our environment, or next to our lights. So how do we get this blue, for example, to feel warmer? Or we can you could, it's difficult here because we're going to train towards things out this way, but we could bump up the saturation, drop the value a little bit, and now it's got like a little bit of like a yellowness in there, right? I didn't really change what was. Okay, it has actually changed slightly. It's shifted a little bit towards here. Let's try again, just to see what happens. I'm going to increase the saturation, drop it down a little bit, get more or less the same. I think that did have a little bit more yellow to it, and that worked quite well. So just a touch. But that looks quite a bit warmer. If I drop that down a bit more, then that shadow is definitely warmer than the cool of this. Follow our usual color scheme. Yeah. I'm going to drop it into here. And I can do the same out here. But I'm not going like, oh, orange. Okay, to try and get, okay, that, but I'm not doing that in this cool environment. It doesn't make sense. It would be, if anything, it would be more desaturated. Next to that would be sort of okay. But we can stick with this. Righty-ho, righty-ho. I want it to be like a bit of a darker, cooler environment that it's coming out of, so I want to intensify this a little bit more. Maybe I'll shift a little bit closer even towards the warmer side of things. Okay. But our light is cool. Let's add some shadow into this. I'm getting caught up in the background. Shadows are going to be warmer, they'll be a bit more saturated. So from here, increase that saturation, drop down a little bit, and with one swoop, we have something in there. But I'm going to shift it a little bit because that blue, the blue environment that it's in is quite strong. So it's going to go a little bit more purple. I'm not following my reference exactly. And I did the wrong thing. I went the wrong direction. Shadows are meant to be warming. Here we go. It's going to be a little bit browner, not a bit more purple, because purple is now leaning towards blue. So our light on here is cold. Now we go a little bit this way, bump up the value, shift over a little bit. Do that. And you can test this out, right? You can take this red, drop it in here, make a new layer, and find this, what is sort of the blue light would be going over it. Drop that over and set the layer mode to overlay and see what it does to the color there. This is probably a bit more saturated than what I've got here, but I've desaturated it going towards the light. Yeah, but quite similar in tone. Whoa! So let's get rid of that layer. Don't need any more. Come back to this. Smooth out some of these transitions. I know that my shadow here is also going to be a bit darker. Maybe I'll trend it a little bit warmer. But it's, I mean, it's almost black sitting on you. It's going to be in a dark environment. So this contact shadow is going to be very dark. But I want it to fade a little bit. Okay. Now we've got some light coming in. I want to accentuate the shadow side of things by increasing the contrast and the gap in values. You know, that's essentially what contrast is. The bigger the gap in values, the bigger the gap between this value and that value, the higher the contrast. These are very close together. We have a low contrast sort of image. Okay, so to do this, if we look roughly at the value of these, I'll say roughly, because remember each color has its own inherent value. Let's put them next to one another. Here, this here. I need this to be brighter. I'm trying to understand now what the value relationship is. So I'm going to color dab and see. Okay, so already there's quite a big gap in value here, but I want to bump that up a little bit more. We've got a cool white light, so I'm going up a little bit in value and adding a little bit of white to it, which is wrong because no, it's right. What am I saying? Shadows are warm. There we go. I'm on the right track. I'm doing so many studies and now everything's sort of blurring into one space in my head. Oops. So thanks to the refresh. Dab it in. Make the brush a little bigger, perhaps, and then blend it. I don't want that whole area to be super light. It starts to compete in a funny way, but I want that. I just want to accentuate these edges here. So I'm just blending things in. Maybe this could be even darker. Quite a dark environment. Which then would mean that I mean, our shadows here are also going to get pretty dark. So we can spread this out. Maybe this. So now if I'm trying to push into a dark environment, I've got to think about all the relationships. What's going on. So this could be, just by dropping the value here, it's getting a bit warmer. How long will we go on for? That's a good question. I'm going to wrap up probably in the next 5 minutes because we've been going for 2 hours almost, and everyone's got things to do, and it's getting late in some parts of the world. But yeah, maybe now's a good time if anyone has any questions. But again, you see, this gets me a solid starting point to go forward with. Now the color's changed again. The size has changed too. There's a little bit of light that pops up here, and probably a bit of bounced light that comes up on the sides. Now when I zoom out, I can read what's sort of going on here. It's it reads as potentially an apple. It just could be rendered better, and all the rest is just going to be rendering. But I've got a sense of light. I can even lighten this up, cool this down a little bit more. Bump up the value a bit. Okay. That gives me plenty of information. Okay, let me try and read what's going on here. Whoops. Multiple monitors to manage. So the next... thanks, Ligav. I'm glad you found the class good. The next Clubhouse will be on Wednesday. I think we'll shift it to our previous time slot next time. So 12-hour difference. We'll do it at 10 a.m. Central Standard. And the next class will be that same time slot on the Thursday. And I think we'll do a rotating time slot so that we can get to different people in different time zones. But the classroom and the Clubhouse will all be on the YouTube channel, so you can plug in after the fact and follow along on your own canvas. Oops. But anyway, I hope you guys found this helpful and makes color a little less intimidating. If we're working just with simple forms, it really helps to get stuck into it. This could also change. I'd probably get more done if I wasn't talking so much, but obviously I have to explain all these different elements. But yeah, the Clubhouse is Central Standard Time. Yesterday was 10 a.m. or today. Where are we now? Yesterday, but next week's one will be 10 a.m. Central Standard. Yesterday was 10 p.m. But just if you're on our Discord, it'll be there. If you're following on, if you subscribe to us on YouTube, then you can find our events there too. We do give it a couple of days notice. So, yeah. Thank you very much, guys. I'm gonna probably keep painting at this to try and get things looking a little more refined, a little bit more realistic, and try out some other color schemes. If you do happen to try this out yourself, then it'd be great to see your examples, see your exercises. You can plug them into either the Share Your Art channel or maybe the Classroom channel on Discord as well. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you have a good night or day, depending on what time zone you're in, and we'll see you again next week.